this one. And so this is the city of Corinth here, sort of in the middle. So right there. And so as you can see, it's kind of at this strait of land. And so kind of on the west side of that is the Gulf of Corinth, and that opens up to the west towards Italy and where Rome is and everything. And then on the east side, the right of the picture, is this bay called the Saronic Gulf. And that opens east towards Asia. And so we would call, actually I'll test y'all's geographic knowledge. So you have a tiny little spit of land like that. What do you call that little tiny little bit of land? An isthmus. Oh yeah, we paid attention in geography class. Gold star. So that's called an isthmus. And actually we have a town here called Isthmia, or in Greek, Isthmos. And so that whole geographic term, even though it's a generic term, it comes from that town and this exact little piece of land right here. So that term, isthmus, comes from that town, which was on the original isthmus. And so that was just outside of Corinth. But as you can kind of see that, having this access to the east and the west would have made Corinth very important, because it would have been this sort of gateway between the two. You could either kind of sail all the way around that, or you could kind of take a shortcut here and this tiny little speck of land that would go across. And so naturally, Corinth became this very strategically important and commercially important place because of where it was on this isthmus. Because by land, if you were an army trying to go north to south, you would have to kind of go through Corinth. You would have to fight your way through that, so it's very important. Or if you wanted to have trade and you wanted to go from east to west, it would be very easy to go through Corinth. So it was very, very important like that. Just to the south of this, and I really wish I could have made a topographic map of this, but there's like this singular mountain peak about a mile south of Corinth. And so it basically sat in the shadow of this mountain, and that's called Acrocorinth, or High Corinth. And on the top of this mountain you had where the more influential citizens would live, and you also had a temple up there. And so that was just sort of the high city there. And so it was just south. So Corinth kind of sat at the base of this singular mountain peak. And so, like I say, Corinth was this crossroads of maritime trade. But as you can kind of see on this map, Corinth itself wasn't on the water. It was actually a few miles away from the water. And so Corinth was served by two ports. And so toward the north, you have a city called Lycaum, right there, or originally Lycaon in Greek, and you had like a little road that still exists to this day going from ancient Corinth to the bay there, Lycaon. And so people could, go down that road and then go west from there. And that's about 1.7 miles away. And obviously there were lots of businesses and things situated on each side of that road on your way to the bay. And then to the east, you have the port of Centria, or Kenkrea if you want to use the original pronunciation. And so that served the east side. And so if you wanted to go east towards like Asia and stuff, that was the port that you would use. And that was about 6.3 miles to the east. Again, not very far, and still served by a road. And so both of these ports. And so you could kind of see that going east to west, someone could progress, through this road system and get goods from the east to the west. But that wasn't quite enough. And I felt like this was kind of interesting what they did. You can kind of see this really short piece of land, the actual isthmus there. And so what they did is that in the 7th century BC, they built this sort of road with this groove in it, and it was called the Diolkos. And it was this paved trackway to haul ships across the isthmus. And it's about 5 miles across. And you can kind of see it by this line right here. And so they carved this road into the ground. And you could basically take goods across it, or you could even haul whole ships across it. And some of that even still exists to this day. And so this is a satellite picture. And right here, that is that original sort of, I don't want to call it a road, but it's this paved trackway that went all the way across. And you could drag goods across it. You could even drag whole ships across this thing. And so, yeah, there's another picture of it there. And then here's a better picture of it right there. And here you can even kind of see the groove that was in the middle of it. And so ships up to like 115 feet long, they would kind of put them on these big wooden sleds, and they would have these teams of people. I don't think they were unionized, but they had to drag these huge ships across this 5 miles of land to get them and plop them on the other side of that bay so that they could skip that sort of dangerous journey to kind of go around that tip of Greece there. And so, yeah, it was used for both commercial and strategic purposes. And so there were times when that would just, shave off a few days' journey by ship, or there were times in which that would shave a few days' journey for war boats, and so that they could be, where they needed to be and, fight or defend when they needed to do that. And so, and in fact, it might be even more efficient to build a canal there. And so rather than dragging these ships across, it'd be easier just to sail them across. And so, in fact, in 67 AD, Nero wanted to build a canal there. And so that 5 miles, they thought they would just dig out a whole canal. And in 67 AD, so right before the Jewish temple was destroyed, when Nero was emperor, he wanted to do this. And in fact, he took people who were prisoners of war from the Jewish Roman war. And he took about 6,000 Judean prisoners, and he said, hey, you guys dig this big ditch. And they started doing this and started trying to dig this canal. There's still like a statue of Nero that exists to this day. And this historian called Suetonius, he reports that the canal was dug to a distance of 4 stades, or 2,300 feet, which is about 1/10 of the way across. From here to here, they made about 1/10 of the distance to cross it. And so they didn't make it. They gave up. They decided, this is way too tough in order to do. But they thought about it. They thought that, so this was so commercially important that they wanted to try to do that. Then finally, fast forward, well over, almost 2,000 years, and the Ottoman Empire has taken control of this territory. It completed that canal in 1893, and that's what you can kind of see here going across. So in 1893, that thing that was finally, planned in 67 BC was finally realized in 1893. And here's a picture of a ship going through it. So could you imagine a bunch of Roman people with no power tools or anything trying to cut that into the rock? It would have been very difficult. Obviously, they give up. Or even more importantly, you see how much that elevation changes. Think that if you were on the team having to drag a ship across that would not have been a very fun time. Having to go up, and then I guess a lot easier when you were going back down. But yeah, it would have been very difficult. So yeah, that's a ship, just to give you the scale of that going through. So, but all of that just to kind of demonstrate the importance of this location and how influential it was from trying to get stuff from east to west and west to east. And so, yeah, it was definitely the center of trade and center of defense at the time. I'm going to pause again. Any questions, thoughts, anything I could explain further? Okay, I'll take that as either a good thing or a bad thing, but... I know, right? I mean, I don't think I could do 1/10. I could maybe do 1/100th of 1/10.
U.S. some incentive at that time to build Panama Canal in
Yeah.
the first 10 years of 1900.
Right, for sure. I mean, definitely influenced, things like that, the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal for sure. And so it's interesting just to know that people were thinking things like that even, thousands of years ago. And so, so more on the city itself. And so largely that city had been destroyed before. It was rebuilt in 44 BC, like I say, and it was called Colonia Laus Julia Corriensis. And so that was its name in 44 BC when Julius Caesar rebuilt it. And then after that, it was largely destroyed by earthquakes in around 365 and 375. So it got hit by one in 365. 10 years later, it got hit by another. And, it was kind of decimated at that point. And so it declined in importance over the years. And, different powers took over. The Roman Empire fell. The Byzantine Empire fell. Ottomans eventually took over. And it was just it had just declined in importance. And so the village surrounding ancient ruins was destroyed in 1858. And then what's now the city of Corinth was refounded on the coast about 2 miles northeast of the ancient city. I'm going to go back here real quick. I should have put this on another map. So the current city exists like right about there on the map. So yeah, they rebuilt it. So what's now called Corinth isn't the same as the original city. So that is the city of Corinth. This is what it looked like in 1847. This painter painted it. And so yeah, this is Corinth with Acro Corinth by an artist called Carl Anton Joseph Rotman. And he painted this in 1847. And so these are sort of the ruins that existed at the time. And that's that Acro Corinth that I talked about. That, it was a very defensible position. And so people throughout history increased the fortifications to it. That's sort of what ended up lasting over the years. And the village was largely abandoned. Here's some picture of what the ruins look like today. So you can see it's not really inhabited anymore, but people appreciate it as this archaeological site. And that's ruins of one of the temples there. And again, that Acro Corinth in the background. And so this sort of singular mountain peak up there, that at the very top of it, they had some residences and they had a temple there as well. And another picture, that same temple, just a little bit closer. So one more aspect of this city is that there was the games. And so we talked about that city called Isthmia that was just a few miles away from Corinth. Well, they had these games that were started, the Isthmian Games. So if you've ever heard of like the Olympic Games, there were like 4 Pan-Hellenic games. And in addition to the Olympic Games, the Isthmian Games was another set of sporting events that was like high in importance. And they were started in 582 BC, so about almost 600 years before Christ. And they were held every 2 years. So the Olympics were every 4 years. The Isthmian Games were every 2 years. And they was held the year before and the year after the Olympic Games. And they were athletic and musical competitions to honor the Greek god Poseidon. And so they did all of this in honor of Poseidon. And so it was interesting that there were also musical competitions as well as athletic competitions here. And so they had, chariot races, they had foot races, they had this one sport called the Pankration, which would mean like all strength. Think of this as the sort of like the ancient version of MMA. So it was like this no-holds-barred fight that you could have between two people, but they had rules. There were no biting, and there was no eye gouging. So this is an honorable sport, so I kind of thought about it sort of like MMA. And then more refined, you have wrestling, and you have boxing. And then in addition to that, there were music and poetry competitions. And in those competitions, both men and women could participate. And this was held at Poseidon's rural sanctuary near that city Isthmia. And that was about 6 miles east, 6 miles east of Corinth, about 2 miles north of that port city, Centuria, that we talked about. And so it was over there. And this was called a Stephanitic game. That's probably not a word that you would use very often. But what Stephanos in Greek means is a crown. And so the prize was a crown if you won whatever event that you had. And usually when we think of that, we think of someone winning the Olympics and they get that sort of olive laurel wreath put around their head. And you can see that on the right, on the right. On that picture, and that's that olive sort of wreath. But yet in the Isthmian Games, they used a pine wreath, and they would sort of crown you with that. So we might kind of see some references to crowns and athletic competition in this letter, and that would have appealed to this, this game that was very popular in this area. And in fact, Nero, the Emperor Nero, he visited the Games in AD 67. And so that was actually a year after he visited the Olympic Games. And he proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks. So he wanted to, sort of smooth things over with the Greek people. And so the games actually were eventually moved to Corinth itself during the first century. And so these games, which historically they had been done in the Isthmia for hundreds of years, by the time of the first century and the founding of this Roman province, they were actually held in Corinth themselves. So when Paul writes about games and competition and training, these people were very well versed in that and very well understood that. And in fact, those games might have even been held while Paul was in that city. So any thoughts, any questions, comments, any additional information we can talk about Corinth? Yes?
The thing I find interesting always about this is you can't tell the grandeur from your pictures of what it was.
Oh, right.
And in their perspective, this is the great act. We will never fall. Kind of our perspective so often is that, look how great we are.
Right.
And now you look at it now and it's like nothing.
Right.
And it's a lesson in some ways of, what you do put your faith in. Because you see how great they were, how great these people thought they were.
Right.
And now it's pretty sad how
Yeah.
it's left.
Right. And other places have risen and fallen throughout all of those years. And we can look at our human institutions and we can think that they're here forever, but they're just, what as Paul puts it, is like vapor, right? It's just here briefly and then it's just gone. Good observation. So let's talk a little bit about Paul and his situation. And we get a lot of information here from the book of Acts. And so Luke records this, and this is in Acts 18:1. And so after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And so we know how close those two were together. He could literally had a road that he could have walked between the two. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. And because he was the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, as they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogues every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. So Paul comes into Corinth in Acts 18, and he finds these people named, Priscilla and Aquila. They're Jewish people who had been kicked out of Rome itself, originally from Pontus. And I think something that'll come out important in the letter is that they were all tent makers. And so they got together, same trade, and they worked together. And so they earned a living. So when Paul was here in Corinth, he wasn't saying, send me money or something, or, I'm going to get sent home or something like that. He worked his way while he was preaching the gospel in Corinth. And that's going to come to pass. That's going to be an important point here. Continuing on in Acts. Verse 7, and he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people. And he stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. And so we have a couple things here. First, we have the mention of Crispus here. And so we go into 1 Corinthians 1:14, and Paul says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except for Crispus and Gaius. And so that might have been the same guy. So we do have some internal consistency there. And then we also have an important detail in verse 11 that Paul stayed there 1 year and 6 months. So 18 months, about 1.5 years, Paul stayed in Corinth. And most people believe that while he was preaching and teaching in Corinth, he wrote 1 Thessalonians. So he wrote back to Thessalonica, which he had previously visited not long before he made it here into Corinth. So Crispus, and then we have the length of time that he stays here, about 1.5 years. So he spent a lot of time with these people. And while he was there, verse 12, but when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. And so we have him in front of Gallio. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, verse 17. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, because Gallio wasn't going to be part of any of this. But then the Jewish people who rejected the gospel seized Sosthenes and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So we have a couple of important things here. First, Sosthenes, more internal consistency. We have 1 Corinthians 1:1, Paul called by the will of God to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, and brother Sosthenes. So could be the same Sosthenes that's talked about in Acts. We know that he was there in Corinth, a person of the same name. And the other big thing is Gallio. And so Gallio was the proconsul. So remember, Corinth was the capital of that province, and so the proconsul would have lived in that city and governed from that city. And so, don't know a whole lot about Gallio, but we know a whole lot more about his younger brother named Seneca, and he was a very important and famous orator. So the younger brother was more famous than the older brother. If you were a regular Bible reader, if you could please raise your hand. So this is a statue of Seneca, a really handsome guy, as you can tell. Really fit, not overweight at all, anything like that. But this is the older brother, but this might give you an idea of what Gallio looked like. They might have looked very, very similar. And so that's Seneca. And in fact, how important Seneca was, this is a double statue of Socrates facing the other way. So if you look at this statue, you can kind of see there's another face. So that's how highly regarded people thought Seneca was. But this might give us an idea of what Gallio looked like. But way more important are these stones that are in the city of Delphi. And at the time, Delphi was abandoned. So remember, Corinth was abandoned because everything was conquered, but yet Julius Caesar repopulated the city. Well, Delphi, another important city to Greece. Remember, they had the oracles of Delphi. It was depopulated and still not populated at this point. And so there was these stones, this commemoration that was made there, that these fragments survive to this day. And there are 9 fragments of this, and this is one of those fragments. And on that fragment, that says Gallion, which is Gallio. And so that's our name, Gallio. And so kind of piecing all of those together and putting it into something we can read, this is what those all say together. Tiberius, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus. Say that 10 times fast. So Emperor Claudius, invested with tribunician power for the 12th time. I want that as my job title. Acclaimed imperator for the 26th time, father of the fatherland. For a long time, I had been not well disposed towards the city of Delphi, so it was still depopulated, but also solicitous for its prosperity, and I have always guarded the cult of the Pythian Apollo. But now, since it is said to be destitute of citizens, as Lucius Junius Gallio, my friend and proconsul, recently reported to me, and being desirous that Delphi should retain intact its former rank, I order you to invite well-born people also from other cities to Delphi as new inhabitants. And so the Emperor Claudius was petitioned by Gallio, the governor that's written about in the Bible, to say, hey, we need to put people here. This is too important of a city to remain empty. And why this is so important is that we know of Gallio, and then we also know that this Gallio was proconsul during this time in which Claudius Caesar was emperor for his 12th year. And so we know a lot about Emperor Claudius, and we know that he reigned from 41 AD to 54 AD. And so the 12th year of his reign would be around AD 52. And so other sources indicate that Gallio was also a proconsul for a very brief amount of time due to illness. And so we know that Gallio was just there between AD 51 and 52, that brief amount of time. And so we know that Paul and Gallio were in the same place. And so therefore we know, because of that stone, because of that little goofy thing that survives to this day, that the events of Acts 18 happened in about AD 51 to AD 52. And so that gives us this firm date of when all of this happened. And so Acts 18 occurred AD 51 or 52. And so during that time, Paul was in Corinth for about 18 months. And so we know that Paul would have written 1 Corinthians sometime later, because he wouldn't have written people that he didn't meet yet. And we know from 1 Corinthians that he met the people that he had written to. And so here's 1 Corinthians 16. And so he also says, but I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. So we know that Paul was in Ephesus when he was writing 1 Corinthians. Then we have in Acts 18, the first mention of Ephesus is after this, Paul stayed many days longer in Corinth, and then he set sail for Syria. With him was Priscilla and Aquila, and they were at Cenchreae. Remember, we talked about that port. They were headed east back to Syria, so of course they would leave through that port, Cenchreae. And he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow, and they came to Ephesus. And he left them there, but he himself went into the synagogue, and they wanted him to stay longer, but he declined. So Paul stayed at Ephesus briefly just after visiting Corinth. And so most people don't think that he was there long enough to write 1 Corinthians. We also talk about Cenchreae because in Romans, Paul mentions Phoebe, because most people believe that Paul wrote for Romans from a subsequent visit to Corinth. And so what happened, and then going into Acts 19, and while Paul was at Corinth, passed through an inland country and came to Ephesus. And so he found some disciples. And so this is later. And he entered the synagogue for 3 months and spoke boldly. So he was there. But then furthermore, after he didn't have any believers from the synagogue, he then reasoned daily in the hall of Tyrannus, and he continued there for 2 years. So he was there for over 2 years in Ephesus on a further visit. And so that's when we believe that he wrote 1 Corinthians. And so here's our timeline, and I'll wrap up here. Is that we think that Paul visited Corinth but sometime between AD 51 and AD 52. And that's when he would have written 1 Corinthians, and that's when Gallio was also in Corinth. And then he returned to Antioch in Acts 18:18. And then he went through Galatia and Phrygia in 18:23. Then he was in the interior region of Asia in Acts 19:1. And then further in Acts 19, he was in Ephesus for over 2 years. And we believe that in that period of time, he wrote 1 Corinthians. And so that could have been AD 54, it could have been AD 55, depending on how long he spent here in the middle, because we really don't know how long that chunk of time took. Some people believe that it was written as late as AD 57. And so anywhere between 54 and 57. Given how brief those chapters are, I kind of tend to take an earlier date, but so I think it's more like either an AD 54 or AD 55. We know that he left Ephesus in the spring, though, because he wanted to leave by Pentecost, and so that would have been 50 days after Passover. So this book is written anywhere between AD 54 to AD 57, well before the Jewish temple was destroyed, etc. But that doesn't really go into the context here because these are mainly, Greek people rather than Jewish people here. Any closing questions, thoughts before we adjourn for today? So hopefully that gives us a little bit of background for this letter. And next week, Lord willing, we will begin with verse 1 of chapter 1. Thank you so much for your attention.